Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, the Ebola pandemic. Our guest, Melvin Foot, founder of the CFA, the Constituency for Africa. Melvin Foot, warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Mr. Foot, how serious would you say that is this Ebola epidemic?
It's absolutely astounding. And I've been working on Africa for more than 35 years, and I've seen a lot of things. We were at the forefront on the HIV/AIDS pandemic and did a lot of work to get that scaled up. But I haven't seen anything like Ebola. And we've known about it for a long time, but it hasn't affected large numbers of people. And for the first time, it has really affected large numbers of people in urban areas. And so the transmission of it, how do you defeat it? How do you deal with people who are affected? There's just a whole lot of issues that are out there that makes this one a lot more complicated and more challenging than anything that we've seen before.
We've seen countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, like the three countries with the most cases.
Yeah, those are the three that the target, but everybody knows that if it's not controlled and soon, the chances for spreading is great. Not only across Africa, but really globally. We've seen cases now in the United States. We've seen them in Spain. We see them other places around the world are starting to show up. And so if this is not controlled in a reasonable, within a couple of months, I think it's going to spread dramatically on the global side.
They're even mentioning a figure of something like 2 million people could be dead by the beginning of the next year if measures are not taken.
Yeah, the numbers are just astounding. And the question largely is political will and resources. You know, these countries are hurting. Not only are they hurting from the epidemic of Ebola, they're hurting now from economic, they're hurting from stigmatism. These countries are fragile. You know, these countries are all coming out of war. They're basically getting their economy straight. They're finally getting some forms of democracy in place, and to be hit by something like this is absolutely overwhelming for these countries and for the region. And so I think for many reasons, this one here is the world is going to have to scale up and to step up. And we're hearing that's taking place, but it's going to step up like we've never done before to address Ebola in West Africa and globally.
And we were hearing precisely here in Washington that the headquarters of the IMF are based, that it could cost something like $32 billion to try to fight against Ebola.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers are astounding. And I think it's a situation as such that we can't even talk about the numbers. We just got to deliver. We got to deliver on research. We got to deliver on treatment. We got to deliver on education. We got to deliver on economic development. The list goes on. But I think that the world has never seen anything as dramatic and as challenging as this epidemic.
Would you say that it was at certain point negligence? Because we have seen in the past few cases, isolated cases of Ebola in Africa. But they were isolated. Suddenly, the whole thing spread like a wildfire. What went wrong?
I think there's a lot of blame to go along. You know, I think certainly the West can be blamed. You know, we're getting oil, we're getting gas, we're getting timber, we're getting food products, we're getting all of this from Africa. You know, and some can argue about fair trade. Some can argue about, you know, are we also helping to develop these countries? You know, or are we only interested in their natural resources? Well, that's one big argument. I think it holds water. I think that is something that needs to be addressed. But also the countries themselves have got to look up, and you got to ask yourself, are they doing what they need to do to address the health systems in these countries, to address education systems in these countries? Or are you waiting for the NGOs and the foreigners to come in and, you know, build your health system? Are you waiting for us to come in to build your education systems? Are these countries investing in the infrastructure and the human side of their own people is a real question. After we completed, not even completed, the battle against HIV/AIDS, that question came up, you know, about health systems. And all the countries were talking about, yeah, we're going to have to build this health system, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have to do that. But what I see, they haven't, you know, they didn't take any action in that direction. And you're looking at the fragility of these health systems in these countries is just as bad as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. That, you know, it's not just us who are at fault here. I think the African countries, the Africa Union, all of us are in this together. And it's not necessary to point fingers, because we all going to have to do things to address it, because it's not limited to those countries. And if it's not addressed in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, we'll certainly be dealing with it in Washington, Ottawa, and London, and all other parts of the world.
Do you see any similarities between the AIDS virus epidemic and Ebola?
Yeah, well, AIDS back then, we didn't know a lot about it. We didn't know how it was being transmitted. We didn't know who was infected, how you get infected, and all of those questions. And once somebody was determined to be infected in Africa, the stigma set in. And nobody wanted to talk to you, nobody wanted to be with you, nobody wanted to, you were ostracized from your own family. I remember those days very well. And so what we see with Ebola is a lot of the same thing, but much worse in the sense that with AIDS, you kind of knew who got it, and then we learned how you do get it. You can avoid it, by having, lack of sexual contact and using a condom, and some of these lessons that we learned, and people applied those lessons. But in the case of Ebola, you can actually be infected just by touching somebody who has the disease. You could be a doctor and get it. You could be a nurse and get it. You could be a taxi driver and get it. You could be anybody. You could be a family member, a brother or sister or a mother or father, and just wanted to hold your child who was infected. That's enough to get it. So the transmission is not clear. Is not fully clear. How do you help somebody if you can't touch them? And the cultural side of Ebola just makes it much more daunting even than AIDS. And I never thought we would see today that we would see something more dramatic and more challenging than HIV and AIDS. But Ebola clearly is that disease.
We're seeing here in the U.S. that was sort of a serum, or it's not a vaccine, but there was something done that was helping fight. How do you see any possibility of fighting the virus in terms of protecting the population?
Well, this is another one again. I think in the case of Africa, we don't respond until we see the commercial value of it. I look at malaria, for instance, and I know we've known how to address malaria maybe 20, 30 years ago. But have we come up with the right mix of vaccines and medicines to address malaria? No. Why not? Because the majority of malaria victims are south of the equator. They're in Africa, they're in Latin America, they're in the Caribbean. They are not people here in the United States. So for us Americans, we didn't think that a malaria mattered. So I think in the case of Ebola, the same thing. Here you got this disease. Sure enough, some scientists and some the CDC, people like that have been looking at all kinds of infectious diseases, and sure, they've been toying with it. But they didn't come up with a serious opportunity to address Ebola until now we figure out that we need something. And everybody telling me it's going to take quite some time to come up with an effective vaccine to prevent the transmission of Ebola. And so in that time, we might be looking at 1 million people or more having died. So, but I think it also speaks to me of making sure that Africa is at a level playing field with the rest of the world.
You were suggesting in a way that if people of south of the equator were treated in a way differently, my question is there sort of a racism or discrimination in the world of when a patient gets sick in a part of the world could be treated differently from another part of the world?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's well known. And it's really kind of sad. Even the case in Texas of the Liberian who came here and his disease became, he eventually died day before yesterday. But his treatment compared to these other Americans who got infected, who were flown back here and isolated, and hope and gladly that they have become cured of this. Absolutely different handling of it. And sure enough, it seems that the life of an African is a lot less valued than the life of an American or a person in other parts of the world, and that has to be corrected.
In the case of the person who died in the U.S. recently, one of the skeptics are saying is it was a way of discrimination because it not necessarily was being treated properly.
Yeah, the proper treatment, the urgency of it seemed like was different. The treatment of the family, certainly who were stigmatized and had to move out of their apartment, and who knows what other things that they're facing right now. It just speaks to the fact that people are ignorant about other people. And because he was African, people are thinking, I have a lot of Liberian friends here in the United States who haven't been to Liberia in 2 or 3, 4 years, but yet they also feel in this stigmatism. All you have to do is say you're a Liberian. Even if you say you're from Zimbabwe, you're going to find people going to be saying, oh, wow, and you're thousands of miles away from the Ebola zone, but yet because you're an African, there are a lot of people who will think that you are a risk because you're an African.
So the U.S. is a racist country?
Well, U.S. is built on racism, no question about that. You look at the history of the country with slavery and, on balance, America is trying its best to address the race question. And it's a long-term proposition that we're making steady progress on. I mean, I don't want to say it's not the same America that was when I was a kid or my parents grew up in, in the South. But America has come a long way to address its racial issues. But no doubt there's still issues in America. I think the fact that President Obama has elevated himself to be the President of the United States, a black man, speaks volumes of race progress in the United States. But we have, we're on the right track, we're on the right train. We just need to put more fuel in the tank and address our racial issues. But I think that this country is committed to doing it, and I'm optimistic.
Particularly in the case of Ebola, there are critics that says that in the cases that have been done in the U.S., there were negligence.
Yeah. I think so. I have no question about that. I mean, you look at America generally, you look at the health system generally. If you are a person of means and have all the wealth, you're going to get a different treatment level than, say, a person who works at the post office or a person who might be homeless, who might be another color. And I'm not totally sure it's race as it is class. But for sure, America is predicated on those who have access to the resources will get the treatment, will get the support that they need. And those who don't have access, which is most Americans, will have a hard time getting the same treatment. So it's not a balanced system, no question about that. And something that has to be addressed going forward. This is what Obamacare is all about. It's an attempt to broaden the participation of more Americans in the health system. And you can argue that in Congress if you want to, but I think that it's something that this country will have to move forward on.
The U.S. government was sending 3,000 army to Africa to help fighting Ebola. What do you think?
Well, I think we have to do something. I've been involved in a lot of the discussions from inception of this crisis, and I was in a meeting with the Minister of Defense from Liberia a couple of weeks ago, and the question was asked about logistics and field hospitals and clearing of the port and some of these kind of things, especially after the Haiti earthquake fiasco. And we all remember how the goods and services got stacked up in Haiti. And the question was, do you want American assistance in this area? And the answer was yes, we want that assistance. So I think the Obama administration's attempt is to initially address the infrastructure challenges. And you need field hospitals, you need logistical support, and I don't know anybody in the world better prepared to do that than the U.S. military. Now, this is not a coup d'etat or it's not a military takeover or anything like that. It's strictly as a humanitarian logistical effort. Now, I also think that a lot of American health professionals and research professors and trainers are also headed out there, and they're not military. And so I think in the case of the United States, we're doing everything possible to address the crisis facing these countries. What
do you know about how the Ebola disease started? What do you know about the history?
Well, from what I understand, a lot has to do with the transmission from animals to human. And some say it's bush meat, which is a certain delicacy of certain people in Africa, and I've been in parts of Africa, and bush meat is what people really want. And somehow the virus was able to jump from the animal to the human. Now, in the past, it's been rural areas that have been affected, and sure enough, we heard about Ebola, but it lasted for a bit and then burned itself out. But this was the first time that it actually went to urban populations, and that's where this big challenge resides. You got large urban areas that are poor infrastructure, poor health systems, poor screening, and this disease was just ripe for a perfect storm, if you will. And so this is the big difference. It's the transmission from a rural community to an urban community. I think it's that. And I think that humans are moving closer. Part of this is land issues. We're moving closer toward animal areas, taking them over and setting up big farms and doing those kinds of things, mechanized farming. And so people have to be further and further out, closer and closer to animal populations. And so I think the potential for viruses to jump from animals to human will increase in that kind of a situation. So that also has to be considered. I think it's in that vein that this Ebola crisis emerged.
How do you think that the African authorities are handling the situation?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think the countries, Liberia and Sierra Leone for sure, are doing a lot to address it. And they from the start, this occurred, it really occurred during the recent U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, where we had all these African leaders here in Washington for this unprecedented summit in August. And the presidents from those countries didn't come. Sierra Leone, who I know very well, President Karoma, elected to stay home because of the emergency at home. And Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who I also know very well, elected to stay home, even though I know both of them really wanted to be here in Washington for this summit. I think the Africans have sounded the alarm. They're doing everything conceivable in their power to address it, but they're overwhelmed by this. And they made the call early for international assistance. I think the UN has been called. I think the World Bank has been notified. I think that other governments have been mobilized. And I think that the world is waking up to this crisis. But I think that
too late?
We're late. We're late, no question about that. And it's unprecedented what we're having to do. And so when we say it's too late, it takes a while to mobilize governments. It takes a while to get the World Bank moving. And that short period of time is causing this thing to really escalate beyond control. And so, what do you do? Governments move a certain pace, and I think that they have moved in unprecedented speed, actually. I think what I'm seeing is unprecedented speed by which the governments of the world are mobilizing. But it's really a daunting challenge that we're up against. So the question becomes one, what do we need to do? And I think no one has a handle on this yet. But what I'm hearing that if we do all these right things and that we respond the best way we can and provide the assistance and support that we need, maybe within 2 or 3 months we'll see a turning of the tide.
And you think that the West is acting because they're really concerned about Africans, or is just another example of selfishness that now we start to get the disease among us, so therefore we are creating awareness? If not, we would not really care about what's going on in Africa.
I disagree. I'm glad I disagree on that one. I think that the United States, I can say that, and I would say most of the governments of the world are genuinely concerned about this and genuinely realize that it's something that must be addressed. I think the fact that the possibility of it being a problem here has certainly made it important to the American voters. It certainly made it of interest to people in Nebraska who are treating cases. And so the American people themselves are concerned. They're concerned for their children. They're concerned for our own survival. So no question about that. That's been a motivating factor. But I don't think that has been the main reason why the United States is moving. I think we recognize this is a security risk. If we don't do something there, sure enough, it's going to affect us as a country. That certainly is important to this country. And I think other countries are seeing it the same way. So I think we're moving because of our own security interests, but we're also moving out of compassion and a need to address this problem. Just happen to be in these countries in West Africa. If they were in Asia or if they were in Latin America, I would expect the same response.
In the particular case of African countries, are the governments doing rush time education on what the population could do to try to take measures in order not to be taking the virus?
I think they're doing the best they can. Sierra Leone last week shut down the government for 3 days, shut down everything for 3 days. You couldn't leave your house. With an ideal of trying to stem the movement of the virus, find out who is infected, and then address those who are affected. I've seen a lot of effort on behalf of the African governments, and no question about it, and they should be commended for it. But I think that it's just a matter of them being overwhelmed with the numbers and overwhelmed with what to do. You're dealing with countries that are poor. You're dealing with a lot of people who are poor. How do you're dealing with issues of food. You're dealing with economic issues. How do people go to work? What about people who are working for the government? The governments have been effectively shut down. The schools have been shut down. What happened to these people, And so it's just, to me, it's a mind-boggling thing that we're up against. And so I commend the African governments for their responses. I commend the African Union has taken it on at the highest level. Sometimes dealing with the African Union is like watching grass grow. It's a slow, methodical process, but on balance, I think that they have taken this on. They're serious about it. I've talked to Dr. Zuma, the head of the African Union, and I can sense that they're very concerned about it, and they're doing everything in their power to address it. So, there's not a whole lot of villains out here. I'm even hearing the Chinese are now scaling up. China is heavily invested in Africa, but I hear the Cubans are sending doctors to Africa, So it's not about an ideology. I think the world has woke up to this disease, and I'm happy to see that, the whole world is responding.
We have seen already some cases in Latin America. We've seen cases in the U.S. We've seen cases in Europe. Are we going to see more cases in the rest of the world beyond Africa?
I'm sure we will. The thing about the United States and some of these other Western countries, the surveillance systems are good. And, I don't envision the same kind of breakout in the United States that we're seeing in these countries in Africa because of the health systems that are in place. We are watching, they're watching everything. We're getting ready to move into the flu season here. And so a lot of the symptoms of Ebola are similar to those who have flu. And so there's going to be all kinds of problems in hospitals trying to diagnose who has flu and who has Ebola, There's also a lot of paranoia about it. As soon as somebody get a headache, they feeling like they got Ebola, So how do you address that? So I'm expecting a lot of chaos. The airports, I'm expecting chaos at the hospitals. I'm expecting there is going to be some instability. There's going to be some spread of it. There's going to be some real people moving around with Ebola who won't know they got Ebola until they arrive here. And so I'm sure some of that's going to happen. But I don't expect any major outbreaks outside of Africa. I don't expect it, but who knows at this stage where this is going to lead, and it could well be in some kind of scenario. Right now, there's all the major meetings in Africa are been postponed. There's no major conferences going on because of the ideal of people having to move around and try to stay somewhat separate. And we might see some of that over here also. These large crowds of people, I wonder if it's a good thing right now to be mobilizing people. I see a need to lessen that for a period until we get a handle of this.
What are the typical symptoms and how this disease evolve until the end?
Well, you start out with headaches and rashes and, some of these kinds of things that could be a number of things. And then it progresses, worse. And then you got issues of blood vessels breaking and, tissue breaking down, and that's causing the bleeding, red eyes and this kind of thing, and the vomiting and diarrhea are prevalent among this. And generally, the disease is carried by body fluids. So we're talking about sweat, we're talking about tears, we're talking about feces, we're talking about blood. And if you don't touch any of this stuff one way or another, you're probably going to be okay. But the problem comes in one way or another, you're coming in contact with a person who is infected, fluids. And that's where the transmission is occurring. And so the question becomes, how do you avoid that? How do you minimize that? And then once you are infected, it also seems to be how sick are you? Do you already have malaria? Do you already have other diseases which are prevalent in some of these countries? Or are you a healthy younger person? Maybe you can withstand this and the fluids and all this that will allow you. So all of those are, it's kind of up to the scientists right now to determine that. But what I'm understanding is those are the basic symptoms of it. And
Mr. Food, what is your advice for every single viewer regarding what they should do, what steps should take regarding this disease?
Well, the bigger thing we need to do is educate ourselves about Ebola, educate ourselves, educate our families, educate the community about Ebola. We all need to be educated about it and the transmission of Ebola, number one. I think I also say Americans, especially as Americans of African descent, the diaspora, we have to be in the vanguard. We have to be more forceful in pressing our governments and pressing these institutions to do more. We have to be the lobby force. I'm glad that all Americans and all people around the world are engaged, but I'm pressing my people, people who are of African descent, to take a more vociferous role in pressing the world to respond. We have to be on the vanguard of making sure that this stays in the news. We got to make sure that it stays in a positive vein. We got to make sure that the families that are affected are getting the treatment that they deserve, and we got to make sure that we're providing the support to our sisters and brothers in Africa. So I'm high on the education. I'm high on the advocacy. This is what everybody can do right now.
Melvin Foot, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.